The Kryptonian prophecy would be at last fulfilled. The son becomes the father becomes the son.
What great, good.
Shut up!
Hey, what's going on, guys? I'm the Mystical Green Beanie, and I'm going to skip over the word foreplay here and get right to the point. Action Comics by Phillip Kennedy Johnson, Daniel Sampieri, Adriano Lucas, and Riccardo Federici is the best superhero comic being published right now. And when I say the best, I'm not saying, oh, well, you know, it's the best out of DC's ongoing titles, or, oh, well, you know, it's the best between DC's Black Label miniseries and you know, there are other comics and all that, or even, oh, you know, it's the best between Marvel and DC respectively. No, like, it's the best superhero comic on the shelves right now. Marvel, DC, Image, AWO, Valiant, all of them. This book literally, metaphorically, defecated a series of gold bricks and sat upon them like a throne and said, "Get your shit on my level." So, cards on the table, I had some pretty big reservations about this book before giving it a shot myself. I was not a fan of the Bendis run, or much rather, what I read of the Bendis run. And I wasn't particularly jazzed about the status quo that he left the character with when his run ended. Between John Kent being aged up and Clark revealing his identity to the world, I wasn't really interested in where the character was going at that point. And then Phillip Kennedy Johnson is brought on board to write Superman, and I don't know this man from Adam. I still can't think of anything really big that his name was attached to. He did a miniseries for DC called The Last God, which I've been told is pretty good, but it wasn't really on my radar because it's a D&D style fantasy horror comic, and sword and sorcery just isn't inherently my thing. He's also the current writer for the Alien series by Marvel Comics, and I just didn't give those a shot because I haven't really been impressed with Marvel's Fox IP licensed books. So that's on me, but it is what it is. But that's about it as far as I'm aware. And after the first arc, where Superman and his son John fight a bunch of dragons, and Amanda Waller's involved and all that, I'll be honest, I wasn't all that impressed. Same with the 2-issue series that he wrote for Future State, which, Jesus fucking Christ, Future State. Look, if you can't say anything nice, don't say anything at all. I will, however, say that my favorite Wonder Girl came from Future State, and I will leave that at that. But I digress. The point that I'm trying to make is that I wasn't really impressed with what Johnson was bringing to the table. Part of that was due to his writing style approach in those first few issues. I felt like he had a good handle on what Superman meant, but I was afraid that he was falling into the trap that a lot of writers fall into, where they wind up simping for Superman so hard that the characterization gets lost behind the iconography, leaving the character feeling hollow and kind of wooden. And the other big factor that was honestly more on my end than Johnson's was that I was more interested in Johnson fixing Superman, as opposed to actually seeing what he was going to do with the land as it had been left soiled. But that's not really what Johnson was interested in doing, and I didn't pick up on that until I started catching up on this run in trade. And so far, the series has been pretty easy to follow, especially if you're trade waiting, or if you just need to catch up so you can follow along in the monthly titles, because I know a lot of people do that too. There are 3 books to pick up. Well, really 4, but it's optional. But there are 3 main books to pick up, collecting 4 arcs. And those are Superman the One Who Fell, which includes the Golden Age arc, which is 2 issues, and The One Who Fell, which I think is like 5 or 6 issues. Action Comics War World Rising, which collects the prelude to the War World Saga, and Action Comics The Arena, which collects the first half of War World Saga. And from what I've read, throughout Johnson's run so far, there's this recurring theme of legacy and the father, and this sort of symbiotic relationship between fathers and sons, and how the two not only learn from one another, but how they make each other better. And you can see this play out through the first 4 arcs that Johnson has completed so far. The first is sort of like a 2-issue prologue by Johnson that picks up where Bendis left off. Clark is Superman 24/7 now because he's revealed his identity to the public, and John is a teenager. And straight up, I love Johnson's take on Jonathan Kent. He didn't 180 me on the age up, but I'm at least 110, which is a hell of a thing to say, I think. The story is largely centered around these interdimensional cockroach dragon things, and they're powerful enough to not only give Superman a run for his money, but they also wind up poisoning him, which is something that I didn't catch on to when I read through this the first time, but is actually something that ties into the Werewolf saga and is pretty important later on. But there's this narration that plays through the 2 issues, which I thought was John when I first read it, and it's all about how when we're children, we think of our parents as being invincible. But the older we get, the more we realize that they're just as vulnerable as we are. And then there's this shift in the dynamics of care, when we start worrying about our parents the same way that our parents worried about us as children. And John is being very overbearing of his father's well-being, especially in battle, because in the 31st century, there were reports of Superman's death or disappearance around this time period. I mean, we all know what that leads to now, but John is very worried for his father in the same way that a lot of people, me, you, most people really, feel worried about our parents as they get older. And the story is concluded with the narrator being revealed as Superman himself, and he recounts the first time that he saw his father, Jonathan, really injured, and how it freaked him out a little bit. But his father gives him this speech about how natural that fear is, because it's a reminder that when your parents die, you have to fill their shoes and do for your children what they did for you. And nobody's ever really ready for that. And that's exactly what Clark's son, Jonathan, is going through. And this actually springboards into the next arc where Superman and John have to travel to a distant planet called Thakram, and it has all these dinosaur bug people, or, you know, whatever the fuck they are.
That's racist.
Anyways, apparently Superman was war buddies with the old king of the Thakramites, and helped him fight off a horde of psychic alien maggots. And I'm not really sure if this is like a deep cut to DC Comics lore, or if Johnson's just pulling some cool shit out of his ass. Either way, it sets the stage for the story, and once Superman and John arrive on Thakram, they find out that the king is actually dead, and his son has replaced him as the new king, despite the fact that the prince, who's now the king, isn't really all that enthusiastic about his new job. And I liked this arc when I first read it, much more than the prologue, but I appreciate it far more now that I have a better understanding of what Phillip Kennedy Johnson and artist Scott Godlewski were doing, especially paired with the 2-issue prologue that Johnson wrote with Phil Hester, because all of this is really setting the stage for John Kent becoming Superman, which is an idea that I'm personally not too fond of. I still feel like elevating John in such a way more or less gives the middle finger to Connor and Kara, who've been groomed for this since the early 2000s. But I can appreciate the idea more, given Johnson's take on John. John very much does not want this responsibility, no more than the newly appointed Thakramite king. And I don't want to give away too much of what happens in this particular arc, because I think some of the reveals and twists are really interesting, and it would be better if you just read it for yourself. But a lot of the story read to me like an acknowledgement of how weird the current state of Superman is, and how nobody's really comfortable with it, but at the same time, trying to propel the characters forward and make the best of what's available, and maybe do something new and interesting. In fact, Johnson pulls a pro gamer move and takes a lot of the IRL problems that fans have with the current state of Superman, particularly the ones surrounding John Kent, and makes that Clark's ongoing pathos throughout the series. Because Clark and Lois essentially missed out on a decade of their son's life. And holy shit, what does that do to a parent? What does that do to a child? And there feels like there's this rift between Clark and John. Not a sense of animosity, really, but there is a disconnect. And I think it was a really good choice to, instead of sweep those feelings under the rug and try to shuffle on, confront those feelings head on and build story around that productively. And all of this brings us to the Warworld saga, which I think is probably the best in-continuity storyline that DC's published for the character in quite a while. First things first, Johnson, even as far as the first arc, foreshadows that Mongol in this run is not the classic comic book Mongol, but instead a usurper to the throne of Warworld. And it's often heavily implied that this new Mongol is the son, or, one of the many sons of Mongol, and counter to the previous two arcs, which all hinge on the idea of sons admiring their fathers, but ultimately dreading the inevitable day where they have to step into their father's shoes. This is the opposite. The Warzone mindset on Warworld hinges on this Oedipal culture of killing the father and one day becoming him, and the patriarch being this tyrant who holds dominion over you, mind, body, and soul, to the point where there's this practice on Warworld where every new prisoner starts off with one chain linking their shackles, and more chains are added to the bonds with every person they kill in the name of Mongol. Like, every kill on Warworld soil is a sacrifice to Mongol, as if he were a god or something, and your reward is an inch of freedom. I think that's a really fascinating idea, and major props to Phillip Kennedy Johnson, Daniel Sampieri, Adriano Lucas, and Riccardo Federici on this. They all did an amazing job with fleshing out Warworld and the culture of Warworld and the Mongols and all that. That was all really cool. But, I digress. So, the story picks up with Superman apparently dying. This is consequence of his battle with the interdimensional cockroach dragon that he fought way back in the first arc. Apparently, that was a creature Mongol Jr. sent to Earth to weaken Superman. And on top of that, there are these intergalactic refugees who crash land on Earth in a spaceship that's held together with the universe's strongest toothpicks and bubblegum, and we find out that these refugees are called Phylosians. And as Supergirl gives the rundown, Phylosians are basically another ancient genetic cousin of Kryptonians, similar to Daxamites, but don't vomit their organs whenever they come in contact with lead. And these Phylosian refugees come from Warworld. In fact, they were sent by Mongol as a means of bait to lure an injured, weakened Superman to Warworld. And there is a lot more going on in the story here. Apparently, there's a whole conspiracy within the Council of the United Planets between Mongol and one of the representatives of the United Planets. And I don't really know where all of that is going just yet, but Superman being Superman takes the bait, because what else is he gonna do? Look the other way? Also, props to Johnson for building off of what Bendis pre-established in his run, where Clark is still reeling from the events of the Man of Steel miniseries, where the Kandorians died, and then later on they were like half resurrected by Ra's al Ghul in a pit of bootleg Lazarus juice. So Clark may or may not have his priorities straight, but now that there's a chance of there being other Kryptonians in the universe who aren't complete dicks, Clark is going to take that chance to save them, and Johnson kind of starts doing like a Moses thing with Superman, which I think is a pretty cool callback to Superman's Jewish roots, as Superman himself is a character who is created by two Jewish kids. So anyways, Superman assembles a team, a new version of the Authority, and that story unfolds in the miniseries by Grant Morrison and Michael Yanine, which I had a lot of fun with, although I know some people aren't big fans of it, but thankfully it's one of those tie-in stories that's an optional read. So Superman and the Authority head to Warworld, and like I said, probably the best in-continuity Superman comic that DC's published in a long time. Phillip Kennedy Johnson, on top of the insane world-building efforts that he puts into redefining Warworld, brings back what I feel is a vital element to the character of Superman, and that's returning him to his pulp science fiction roots. And a large part of that definitely lies in the art by Riccardo Federici. Every panel of every page feels like a cover to an Edgar Rice Burroughs novel. Furthermore, once the book gets to Warworld, Johnson rips off the kryptonite condom and goes hard as a motherfucker with the action. In the first few issues of Warworld Saga, Daniel Sampieri does the art, and I fucking shit you not, Mick Gordon's soundtrack for Doom Eternal played in my head on loop. Between the balls to brains action, dense lore, and pulp sci-fi horror aesthetic, I was hooked, and I remain hooked. And at the end of the day, I think the big thing that really speaks to me with Johnson's run on the character is that Superman is a character who, going back to the later Golden Age stories, is mired in daddy issues and paternal insecurities, often in relation to the legacy of Jor-El and the legacy of Krypton. It's an inner conflict that's become somewhat core to the character at this point, and it's been a key source of drama throughout Superman's pop culture history, going as far back as Richard Donner's Superman duology. Those movies are very interested in the somewhat antagonistic relationship between Superman and Jor-El, as Clark spends the bulk of those movies trying to substitute the void of his adopted father Jonathan after his sudden death with Jor-El's AI, and it don't work. You know, AI Space Dad don't work like that. Meanwhile, Zack Snyder's trilogy is actually more concerned with Clark's relationship with his adoptive father Jonathan and Jonathan's cynical worldview. Jonathan is a very fearful man who realizes that humanity ain't shit, and we don't deserve shit, because we can't have nice things. And those movies are ultimately a coming out story, with Jonathan telling his son to not come out because the world will eat him alive, and Clark ultimately disobeys his father, and he puts on the cape, and he puts on the bodysuit, he puts on the red boots and all that, and he does the thing and becomes Superman. And then the world proceeds to eat him alive. And even beyond the films, you know, the video games and the comics are all mired in similar Oedipal themes as well, especially in recent years with the Injustice franchise, where Superman is robbed of fatherhood, so he just winds up becoming a dictator, or Earth 2, where an established, more traditional fatherly Superman is flipped by Darkseid, and even in the main continuity, where Jor-El is brought back to life, but he's evil. And even now, with Tom Taylor's series that's focused on John Kent, the crux of John's character is wanting to be a better Superman than his father, because Twitter, I guess? And you see this Oedipal conflict even play out in Superman pastiches, between the rising popularity of Invincible, which largely hinges on the conflict between Mark and his father Omni-Man, and The Boys TV series, with Homelander acting as this overarching villain, embracing the more retrograde, counterproductive aspects of patriarchal American values in his attempts to make America great again. Superman has been sort of confined to this cycle of either rebelling against his father or being the father figure who is to be rebelled against. And I think Superman being a father, despite some of the issues that I've taken with that idea, which I've talked about in the past, from a narrative and character perspective, is actually perfect for the character's evolution, and the next logical step in his progression. And so far, Phillip Kennedy Johnson is executing that character evolution wonderfully. But what about you? What are your thoughts? Are you liking the current run on Action Comics? Are you not a fan? What are your thoughts on Superman being a dad? You know, are you a fan of Dad Superman? Are you not a fan of Dad Superman? I'm curious to know down below in the comment section. Also, are you excited for the upcoming Joshua Williamson run on Superman, which will run concurrently with Phillip Kennedy Johnson's run on Action Comics? Let me know down below in the comment section. Also, if you like this video, hit the like button, share, support the channel, and if you want to see more content like this, all you have to do is subscribe. I'm the Mystical Green Beanie. Thank you for watching, and as always, until next time, adios nachos, adios.